Just come on out. Come on out.
Hi.
Well, good afternoon to you. We're delighted to welcome you here to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and to welcome you to the Directors Forum entitled Getting Ahead of AIDS, the Long-Term Agenda, with Dr. Peter Piot and Congressman Jim Leach. The Wilson Center is pleased to be hosting today's important event as part of the Center's new Global Health Initiative. That initiative is very ably led by Dr. DeBelco at the end of the table. We meet at a time of two important landmarks: the 25th anniversary of the discovery of the HIV/AIDS virus and the 10th anniversary of UN AIDS. These landmarks provide time for pause and reflection. There is much to be proud of. Remarkable advances have been made in prevention and treatment, and extraordinary work has been done by UN AIDS and others. But all of us know that much, much more must be done. And so today we look ahead to the key challenges that we face in the years ahead. With us are two men who are exceedingly well qualified to discuss the long-term agenda in the fight against HIV/AIDS, Peter Piot and Jim Leach. Dr. Piot is Undersecretary General of the United Nations. He's been Executive Director of UN AIDS since its creation in 1995. Under his leadership, UN AIDS has spearheaded global action against HIV/AIDS, bringing together 9 UN organizations around a common agenda. Before coming to UN AIDS, Dr. Piot distinguished himself as a scientist and manager. He co-discovered the Ebola virus in Zaire in 1976, launched a series of health projects in Africa throughout the 1980s, including the first international project on AIDS in Africa. In 1992, he joined the global program on AIDS at the World Health Organization as Associate Director. He is making a repeat visit to the Wilson Center. We were pleased to host him with Ambassador Randy Tobias in a remarkable forum, as you perhaps recall, in 2004. Our other distinguished speaker is Jim Leach, United States Representative from Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, and a very good friend of mine over a period of many years. Jim has served in the Congress since his election in 1976. He's an extraordinarily able member of the Committee on Financial Services and the Committee on International Relations. He chairs the Subcommittee on East Asian and Pacific Affairs, was quoted, I think, in the morning paper on that topic, and has provided extraordinary leadership in raising the profile of HIV/AIDS in the Congress and in working with individuals and institutions around the globe. Before his election to the Congress, he worked in the private sector in his home state of Iowa and held several positions in public service. He began his career as a staff member for a congressman by the name of Donald Rumsfeld, and went on to serve as a Foreign Service officer in the 1960s and the early 1970s. It's my very great pleasure to welcome these two distinguished gentlemen this afternoon to the Wilson Center. I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Piot. Doctor?
Thank you very much, Lee, and good morning, everybody. Let me first say how much I appreciate to be back here and for the work that the Center is doing on AIDS, global health. I remember the first time that we met, Lee, it was kind of that we challenged each other where you challenged me in terms of, let's say, the foreign policy, the political, the security dimensions of AIDS, to make that clear. And I said, why aren't you having a program on dealing with AIDS, one of the make or break issues of our time? So here we are. So thank you very much for that, and I really appreciate it, and I appreciate your leadership. Congressman Leach, I think your leadership is not only outstanding, but is also is long-standing. It's from you've been a strong advocate for a U.S. leadership in the global fight against AIDS, and thank you for that. And I'll come back to how important it is to continue that leadership. It's good also to see back so many friends and colleagues, and this has always been a very stimulating intellectual environment. So this is not going to be a speech, a collection of sound bites, but it forced me to think: where are we going? What about the next 25 years? Because as we just heard, 2006 is an unusual year. It's a highly symbolic year in the history of AIDS and in the fight against AIDS, because of the 25th anniversary on the 5th of June, 1981. So that's a quarter of a century. We're now moving from counting in years to parts of centuries. The story of 5 gay men in Los Angeles with a mysterious pneumonia was published. And since then, about 65 million people become infected with HIV, and already 25 million have left us, killed by HIV. In addition to the 10 years of UNAIDS was also it's the 10th anniversary of the discovery that treatment actually can stop the development of disease and actually can bring people back to normal lives. That happened 10 years ago. And that revolutionized the disease, at least in the rich countries. It's only recently that this remarkable technological development is also becoming available in poorer countries. So that took close to 10 years, and it's still a dream for millions of people who actually need it today. Another anniversary from a bit of a UN perspective, but 2006 marks the 5th anniversary of the special session of the UN General Assembly devoted to AIDS. It was the first time that the General Assembly, the UN, at the top political level, there were like 35 plus heads of state, treated and discussed a health issue for 3 days, and turned, in a sense, AIDS from a public health problem, which of course it still is, into also an issue that is discussed at the top political level. And that special session really had an enormous impact. At the time of the special session, I only saw the problems and the logorrhea, the speeches after speech, but after the special session, the Global Fund was created. That was one of the resolutions. Funding went up in a dramatic way, and in many countries, national AIDS councils were created, which were led by the president or the prime minister or the vice president. What also has drawn me back here is that the landscape of the fight against AIDS has been transformed in the last 15 months. It was like about 15 months ago, near World AIDS Day in 2004, that I was here with Ambassador Tobias. Issues that were gathering momentum when I spoke last time have come to fruition. So I now look at 2005 as probably what was the least bad year in the history of AIDS. There have never been good years, that we all know. But It's a year when hope is slowly taking over the pure despair in many, many communities. And things that seemed impossible or a dream even a few years ago started becoming real in 2005. And so for the first time ever, I believe that we have a real potential to get ahead of this epidemic. And this has brought me back here. So what happened over the last roughly 2 years? What came to fruition? 4 key developments, both from a political perspective and an operational level. First, funding. That's the easiest to measure. Funding for the global response to AIDS continued to increase at a record rate from $5 billion in 2003 to about $8.3 billion last year. This is money spent, as we estimate in UNAIDS. These are not commitments or budgets allocated. It's money spent. And about 1/3 of that funding is coming from the domestic budgets of low and middle income countries. And many of the countries, like South Africa, Brazil, India, also Russia now, are starting to devote significant domestic budgets to the fight against AIDS. And I think that's extremely important. It indicates that the issue of AIDS is being owned by the countries that are affected. Because as long as this is perceived as something that comes from the outside, we have no chance to end this epidemic, not even mentioning the funding of all this. The single biggest change that happened in the last 5 years in terms of funding, and when we moved definitely from the M word to the B word, from the millions to the billions, was the State of the Union address in 2003 when President Bush announced that he would request $15 billion for the next 5 years to fight AIDS in the world. And that has been followed by many governments, and that has really made this qualitative leap that the world needed. Because up to then it was $50 million more, $100 million in the best case, but never this qualitative jump that we really needed to have the confidence of everybody to start large-scale programs and to include also access to antiretroviral therapy. Second, it's not only more money, but also a strong movement to increase the efficiency of what we're doing, what we call in our soundbite internally in UNAIDS, making the money work for people on the ground. It's not enough to have money, it has to reach the people who need it. And I think thanks a lot to the work that we catalyzed as UNAIDS, there is now far greater efficiency, better coordination, things that put people to sleep when you start talking about it, but I can guarantee you this better coordination is about better quality of what we're doing, better value for money, and in that sense, it really saves lives. The problem is, of course, that the pace of progress has also been unacceptably slow. We're still far from the emergency pace demanded by 14,000 new infections every day, 6,000 deaths every day, deaths from AIDS. And at the end of May, UNAIDS will issue a report where we review country by country progress or non-progress in some cases in a number of areas that are relevant for the response to AIDS, and giving actually report cards and scorecards. And some of the statistics are actually sobering because they defeat what we thought would be the easier part. For example, only 1 in 10 pregnant women today in the world have actually access to means to prevent mother-to-child transmission prevention. Here we have something that is scientifically clearly proven, a straightforward medical intervention, and something that is measurable, and that is, I guess, not so controversial from whatever perspective you look at it. And yet, it's not being implemented on a large scale. There are some exceptions. For example, Botswana is now close to 50% of all women have access to these services and to the full package. So that there are some good news stories, but they're still the exception. And we know that only 1 in 5 people living with HIV who need actually antiretroviral therapy do have access to antiretroviral therapy. So we'll see by the end of May, just before a special session, another special session in the General Assembly, what kind of progress we've made. And I think the picture will be mixed. Some good progress in some countries, no progress in others, and many in the middle. Third, by the middle of 2005, there was global commitment to making this not simply the era of large-scale implementation, but even more ambitious, as the language of the G8 summit in Gleneagles in Scotland in July 2005 said. We're to come as close as possible to universal access for the whole range of essential HIV programs. So that's really taking the next step. And fourth, but certainly not least, is that by the close of 2005, there was very welcome new proof from every continent that we can get ahead of the AIDS epidemic, that our investments are starting to pay off. Until recently, all I could say when people asked me, show me that it's possible to have an impact with your programs in the developing world. And I could mention Uganda, and I could mention Thailand, and that was about it. And the credibility of this became quite limited after so many years. Today we can say that in Kenya we see a nationwide decline of HIV infection, particularly among young people. Same thing is true in Zimbabwe, going through such a difficult time. In several Caribbean countries, closer to home, and in the urban populations of many East African countries. So there's real progress. And I think it'll be very important that we can demonstrate that all these investments are actually making a difference in people's lives. But we have still old problems and new problems. And the two issues that have been on my mind the most over the last year or so is, one, what I mentioned before, is making the money work. Making sure we invest in, in delivering the goods. Besides mobilizing the money. But the second thing, and that's what I want to concentrate the rest of my speech on, and that is about the next 25 years. Ensuring that there is a sustainable response, a long-term response, which will eventually end this epidemic. That's the kind of ambition we need to have now. And, but of course, we still have an emergency, and the E in PEPFAR means emergency response, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. But I hope that the successor of PEPFAR can get ahead of and get over the emergency, and I don't know with what letter to replace the E, but permanent may be too long, but it should be really a sustainable emergency response. That is still necessary. So we need, in any case, we need more of the same. It's not that when you move to a new phase that you throw away everything that has been done. No. We have to build on what has been happening, more of the same, continuing to expand the programs, increase our effectiveness, and that remains as important as all. But just think of what is now well over 1 million people who are benefiting from antiretroviral therapy today, thanks to all this new funding and so on. We want these people to be alive 20, 30, 40 years from now. How are we going to ensure that? And that's not only let's say, a technical medical question. Who will pay for that? What about the community sustainability, the individual sustainability? So for me, what I'd like to do now is go over what I see 7 critical action items for the long term of actions that will need to be sustained for the next decades. And it's time that we start thinking in terms of decades as the unit, the decade, instead of a year when it comes to the response to AIDS. That's a nightmare, a fiscal nightmare, I know, a political nightmare, but we've got to face the reality. These 7 points are more than the double than of my usual 3 points, and I know that's every speechwriter tells me that that's not very proper. But the sobering reality is that it will take nothing less than this complete agenda of action to end this epidemic. And the first one, and let me make no bones about it, is that we must take real headway in addressing the fundamental drivers of this epidemic, and most particularly AIDS-related stigma, the inferior position of women in so many societies, and issues like homophobia. Before coming here, I was in a session with Secretary Tommy Thompson on reporting on a visit that he led for CSIS in Vietnam. And the stigma, the discrimination, was identified as one of the key obstacles to programs. So it's not only a matter of respect of human rights, which of course is enough to deal with it, but it's also a programmatic issue. It's not the easiest topic in any society, these drivers. And of course, we should not count on or wait for the end of inequality, the end of poverty, and the equality of men and women. But I strongly believe, based on what we've been seeing over the last 20 years, that we need to make serious headway on these drivers of the pandemic if we are to have a hope of ending it. And this is not a call for a vague reform agenda whatsoever. But we all know that there are a whole range of very concrete things that must be done today, and ranging from very practical aspects of women empowerment in the first place, to confronting homophobia and changing social norms and behavior, particularly when it comes to sexual behavior. The values, the norms in society must change. There is no alternative for that. And yesterday it was International Women's Day, you all know, and I was at the 30th anniversary of the International Center for Research on Women, and visit with the Women's Collective of HIV-positive women here in Washington, D.C. And these issues that are not immediately technical AIDS issues, let's put it that way, I believe are as important to stop this epidemic as so-called AIDS interventions. Secondly, we have to sustain leadership and political support for the global fight against AIDS, not only from top politicians, the presidents and so on, but also at every walk of life, in every business, in every church, in every community organization, women's organization, and so on. And it must remain a non-partisan issue, as I believe it is. And that's also because of this long-term need for political engagement and support in public opinion that I firmly believe that we need to expand the coalition of constituencies that are fighting against AIDS. Build new alliances, be less purist perhaps, move out of our narrow circle of, let's call it AIDS bureaucrats like me, of AIDS activists, of those who are fighting and have been sometimes the guerrilla troops in the fight against AIDS. And that should continue, don't misunderstand me. But we need to go beyond that. And I believe that this is happening now. I think that what happened here in the United States, of something that traditionally was, let's say, a liberal agenda, AIDS issue, has become the agenda of a much broader base in society, is a very important development. And I see it happening in other parts of the world as well. And the day before yesterday at Georgetown University, I devoted a speech really thinking through what does it take to build that broad movement? What are the common values that should be the basis of that movement? What are the deliverables that we agree on? And everybody who agrees on these is part of it, and we move. Of course, there are unavoidable conflicts, particularly when it comes to funding. And I see the backlash going from jealousy to the feeling that there's too much money going to AIDS, and not putting AIDS in the broader context of development, of security, where it should fit, and not in terms of competition with other diseases. Third, and of course related, is sustaining and increasing financing and making it more predictable and guaranteed for the long term. Think of the people who are in treatment that I mentioned. The shortfall is already huge. Even with this greatly increased funding, the gaps between the needs and the needs that can be met if the money is there and what is available is likely to increase. For this year alone, $15 billion will be necessary, and for 2008, about $22 billion. Why is that need increasing? Among other things, because people living with HIV over time, more and more will need treatment. So that's one thing. And secondly, as we roll out programs, the capacity to spend the money is also increased. So for some time, the need will go up. But that won't go forever because there should be a return on the investment after a number of years. Now the question is, where will this money come from? First, I would say, and this is a message that I bring wherever I go, is that the developing countries themselves must contribute from domestic budgets. And as I mentioned before, more and more are starting to do that. And that is definitely realistic for so-called middle-income countries. The countries with flourishing economies and so on, particularly in Asia, in Latin America, that's perfectly possible. However, for the poorest countries, and those are the ones that happen to be the most affected by HIV and not by chance, because they're so poor, this is a fiscal nightmare. Because basically, in an unprecedented way, up to millions of their citizens depend directly from foreign aid for their lives. Literally, it's a matter of life and death. I believe, of course, that foreign aid and development assistance saves lives, but it's in a more indirect way. In this case, if I'm on HIV, antiretroviral therapy today, and for some reason, whoever the funder is decides to stop funding that program in my country, that means that I'll be dead within X months or in general. That's the situation we have, unprecedented in international relations. And we know that development assistance is pretty unpredictable and volatile. So this is really a very big challenge. We have, of course, international agreements such as the Monterey Consensus and so on. And in Europe, particularly, there are currently alternatives for development funding that are being examined. None of them has reached broad consensus at the moment, from an airline tax that France is advocating for, and which now a number of countries are going to do, and this will provide additional funding, definitely, to the British proposal for international finance facility, raising money from the capital market. And I think these are all worthwhile looking into. What matters is that at the end of the day, the rich countries will identify the necessary money to continue the fight against AIDS. But what will be key for that, for this continued financing, is one, that we can show results, not spin doctoring them, but real results, so that we invest in measuring what is going on the ground. And secondly, that public opinion in the rich countries, the voters, the taxpayers, continue to be aware that this is an issue that is important for the world, that, to use that economic term, it's a global public good to fight AIDS even 5,000 to 6,000 miles from where your hometown is. And again, we'll have to make sure that that broad coalition continues to work for that. Fourth, HIV prevention needs to be put on equal footing with HIV treatment. In 2001, when we had a debate in the General Assembly, we spent entire nights, literally entire nights, over the debate. I mean, not me, I'm the Secretariat, but the member states of the UN, debating whether there should be any reference to antiretroviral therapy. That's only 5 years ago. In the end, there was a reference to it. But every single donor, including the U.S., except for France, but every other donor, and the African countries, the Asian countries, they were all against any reference to that. Only the Latin Americans and the Caribbean countries were in favor of that. 5 years later, that debate seems totally absurd. But it illustrates how far we've come. But now what we're seeing is that in many countries, HIV prevention is slipping off the agenda. And there is simply no way, with 5 million new infections every single year, that we will be able to provide antiretroviral therapy to all these people. Just looking from that perspective. Not to mention the fact that every single infection is one infection too much. And that our goal should be that we have an HIV-free new generation. The next generation should be without HIV. Priority should be given to keeping young people free from HIV. And that is more controversial than access to treatment, but we have to do it. And in the long run, as I mentioned, it will mean changing norms and values in society. Fifth, we need to finance innovation just as much as we need innovation in financing to accelerate technological development and simultaneously put in place the systems and agreements that will guarantee wide and equitable access to microbicides, new generations of drugs and vaccines. Sixth point is that we must work urgently and immediately to strengthen the delivery systems. That is the Achilles heel of many programs. What is happening is that we are now paying the price for decades of neglect of investments in public services to deliver goods, in private services, school systems, health systems, so on. For decades, we've not invested in that, be it the governments of the developing countries nor the donors. Because we were focusing on projects and felt, okay, the systems and the staff, the bricks and mortars, that's not a problem. And we're paying a price for that now with the AIDS crisis. And it's not just private delivery, but also the public sector, because in many countries, it's the public sector that is where the poor can go. So we must not only support private delivery systems, but also the public sector. And in some countries in Africa, we don't have only a brain drain in terms of professionals, but a brain hemorrhage. Doctors, nurses, actively being recruited, first often going down south to South Africa, and then going to the UK, the US, etc., Australia. We're all struggling with shortage, particularly of nurses. So there are very complex causes and no simple solutions. Books have been published on it, but usually to describe the problem. But we can't go around it. The healthcare delivery system must be boosted in a way that it can deliver and it can meet the means for the demands of people. And any missing input will leave programs unable to produce. Fortunately, though, for prevention, for HIV prevention, the healthcare system is much less critical. I mean, it is critical for prevention of mother-to-child transmission, for some counseling and testing programs, but most of HIV prevention goes on outside the healthcare system. It's about communication. This is where I think the private sector, the voluntary sector, can be extremely important. I believe that we need to start thinking out of the box. Of course, we need to intensify training programs, go for incentive schemes, and there are some good examples going on now in Malawi, for example, in Zambia. But I believe that we'll have to look beyond traditional Western models of delivery systems and go for community delivery systems in a bigger way. And I've seen that it can happen. Around the church, I've seen it in Kampala, I've seen it groups of women living with HIV in Nairobi, traditional structures in Swaziland. It is possible, but it requires that the professionals, instead of continuing to deliver the service directly themselves, become managers, assure quality, training, etc., etc. And most people didn't go to nursing school or to medical school to do that kind of job. So that is a kind of a cultural revolution that is necessary, and we have to think how to do that. But the dilemma is that we cannot wait until the health systems and the health services are fixed to deal with this AIDS epidemic, because that's a debate that I'm hearing. I heard at the World Bank earlier this week. I'm hearing it from people who have been rightly so interested in health systems, but that has been tried for many decades. So we need to move on the AIDS agenda while also strengthening health, education, and all other systems. And my last but not least point is that for the severely affected countries, particularly in southern Africa, we need to start effectively countering the social and economic devastation caused by AIDS, the aftershocks that have massive knock-on effects from one generation to the next, and which will make that in southern Africa, some of the smaller countries may become undeveloping countries, a term that probably is not yet in the dictionary, but if it goes on like this, countries like Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, which is so well managed, but in general, but which has already lost, 30, 40 years of life expectancy have been shaved off. So we need to start addressing the societal impact of the AIDS epidemic, these countries, both from the general perspective, but also from the AIDS perspective, because the capacity to deliver goods, to resist the resilience in society is undermined every single day. So we need to work on that even. And that goes from agriculture. You know, my good friend Jim Morris said, that many of these countries now are in a state of chronic emergency when it comes to food security because of AIDS. Service delivery, the transfer of knowledge in schools, orphans, the child-hearted households. And Anne Veneman, the executive director of UNICEF, and myself, last year in October launched a new campaign on Unite for Children, where we try to emphasize far more all the impact, to counter the impact of AIDS on children. And compared to the unprecedented scale of the losses, really next to nothing has been done on this impact alleviation. We'll have to rethink even how the public sector functions and can function in the worst affected countries, which means that we have to go beyond narrow HIV interventions in order to deliver on AIDS. Food, nutritional support, a bicycle. I was with Anne Veneman in Mwanza in Lake Victoria in Tanzania, and we would talk to people and asked, what is your biggest problem in people living with HIV? It was food and not having the bus fee to go to the clinical center 30 miles away. But the problem is, can we build that on the AIDS budget? How far should we go? But in order to deliver the programs, we'll have no choice, I guess. So basically, AIDS focus is now to rethink how services are being delivered, how knowledge is transferred in the worst affected countries. So much of what is needed is clearly hard work in the trenches, a combination of leadership, good management, and strategic investments. These are not always the most spectacular issues. They won't make it to the headlines often. They're not very sexy. But that's what's going to make or break programs and success. So to conclude, I would say that mobilizing action for this longer-term agenda should now also become a core priority for all of us. And it's important that we, today, we start really preparing the future for after PEPFAR, to make sure that the Global Fund continues to be funded, that countries look beyond the getting people just on treatment, but also keeping them on. And our part of the effort in UNAIDS is partly to improve the evidence base for the longer-term agenda. We've been working with scenario developers, particularly from Shell Oil Company, and looked into what will AIDS mean and what are possible scenarios for Africa by the year 2025. What does it take of action today to make sure we go to the most favorable scenario? And it really showed clearly that we've got to start looking at the wider agenda. So in concluding, I want to emphasize that our reaction to having to face up to these longer-term demands and challenges should not be paralysis. As at the beginning of the epidemic, we were often paralyzed. But the recent years have demonstrated that when we take it on in a systematic way, strong leadership and good management, that we can really make progress. So I believe that this committing ourselves to the strategic agenda will mean that we will now are getting into the beginning of the end of this epidemic. And here, U.S. leadership is irreplaceable. Nothing in the whole world can replace that. I'm not only talking about the money that comes from the wealthiest country in the world, but also the political leadership, the signals that are being sent, the fact that AIDS is becoming an integral part of foreign policy, of the core international development agenda, and that, for me, is how I look at Washington. This is how I look at the achievements that have been done today, but the journey ahead is going to be a very long one. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, I'm honored to speak at an institution led by Lee Hamilton, who is truly one of the most respected members of the House of Representatives in the 20th century. I'm also honored to be appearing with you, Peter. Your extraordinary leadership of UNAIDS is an inspiration to us all. We often hear in this town about the warts and difficulties with the UN system, but it should be underscored that what Peter and his colleagues represent is the professionalism and commitment to public service that symbolize the high purpose and ideals with which the UN and its member states aspire to. So we honor your commitment, Peter. As this audience knows well, this marks the 25th anniversary of the discovery of AIDS and the 10th anniversary of UNAIDS. Although the world was a bit slow to understand its full ramifications, HIV/AIDS today is arguably the biggest public health and strategic challenge of our time. On the plus side, from an American perspective, on a bipartisan and bi-institutional basis, the United States government has provided more than half of AIDS assistance in the world. On the minus side, it is a fraction of what is necessary. The Global Fund, for instance, currently faces approximately a $3.5 billion shortfall. While U.S. public resources by a 6 to 7 to 1 margin are for bilateral HIV/AIDS programs, I'm proud that there is a multilateral dimension, and particularly proud that this dimension sprung initially from congressional rather than executive branch initiatives. Well, the authorization sanction began largely through the efforts of the House Banking Committee in the 1990s. Appropriations were lacking until the executive branch began pushing the effort under this administration. Perspective is always hard to apply to events of the day. For example, if one were to look at the 14th century, one would be hard-pressed not to conclude that the most important event was the bubonic plague, during which 20 million people approximately died. With regard to AIDS, this awesome number could be a multiple of that figure. In a circumstance in which AIDS epidemic is destabilizing entire societies, it's self-evident that discovering techniques to eradicate the disease is the most important health challenge ever, although it could be secondary if flu gets out of hand. As we all understand, however, discussions about international affairs tend to revolve around far-reaching questions about the threat of terrorism, the use of force, weapons of mass destruction, the nature of sovereignty, and the right to intervene. Yet it's also important to understand that the scope of national security is expanded to include not only traditional concerns of protecting and promoting American well-being from direct threats abroad, but the challenges of a globalized world, including the threat of diseases like AIDS, sustainable development and hunger, environmental degradation, population growth and migration, as well as economic competitiveness. According to the Surgeon General, the spread of AIDS has become the worst epidemic of infectious disease in recorded history, eclipsing the bubonic plague, as well as the flu of 1918 and 19, which also led to approximately 20 million deaths. As Dr. Piot has noted, worldwide there are already an estimated 25 million deaths from AIDS, the overwhelming majority of which have occurred in sub-Saharan Africa, and that more than 40 million people are living with the disease, which is twice as many as a decade ago, and about 90% of those infected are in the developing world. The cost in life, well, first let me say, in my lifetime, and I began a career in the United States Foreign Service and was particularly involved in arms control and disarmament at that time, I assumed that the greatest issues in the world were war and peace. And when we think of weapons of mass destruction, that may still be the case, but it also may be the case that the disease challenge is greater than the war challenge. And for example, if one assumes, and these statistics could be off by 100%, but if 50,000 people have lost their lives in Iraq, about 3,300 being Americans, and if one assumes that in AIDS 25 million people have lost their lives, that's a relationship of about 250 to 1. AIDS has killed more people than the war in Iraq. And if you look at the priorities of the United States, we spend about at a minimum 30 to 1 more on the war in Iraq than we do on AIDS. And so if you use death as a standard, and I recognize that freedom is also a standard, and so that there is competition, but if you use death as a standard index, our priorities are askew by about 7,500 to 1 in terms of how money is allocated in a budgetary sense. Now, that isn't the only standard that can be applied to issues, and so it may not be a perfect one, but a death index is a particularly chilling notion to praise budgetary priorities, and one that we all must keep in mind. The cost in life and potential for children is particularly troubling. In addition, the gap between rich and poor countries in terms of transmission of AIDS from mother to child had been decreasing, now may be increasing, which threatens the progress that has been made in many societies. Indeed, HIV/AIDS is shaking the foundation for the future of lots of countries, particularly in the developing world. Economists suggest that it will lower the growth rate in South Africa's GDP by 20% over the next decade. Other nations of the region may suffer equal to even greater damage. Even more poignantly, many southern African states have seen their average life expectancy plummet to well less than 40 in a mere several decades. As current rates of infection and growth rates for HIV/AIDS, the National Intelligence Council estimates that the number of AIDS orphans worldwide will increase dramatically, possibly threefold or more in the next 10 years, contributing to economic decay, social fragmentation, potential political destabilization in already volatile societies as children without care or hope are drawn into prostitution, crime, substance abuse, or child soldiery. A recent unclassified assessment by the U.S. intelligence community highlighted the rising HIV/AIDS problem through 2010 in 5 countries of strategic importance, or particular strategic importance to the United States, that have large population at risk for HIV infection: Nigeria, Ethiopia, Russia, India, and China. According to this report, it will be difficult for any of the 5 countries to check their epidemics by 2010 without dramatic and sustainable shifts in priorities. The last 3 nations, which collectively contain close to a third of the world's population, are likely to experience significant economic, social, political, and other repercussions from the spread of this disease. These appalling statistics and projections beggar the imagination, but progress is to some degree being made. Some developing nations, such as Uganda, Senegal, and Thailand, have implemented prevention programs that have substantially reduced the rate of HIV infection. But much more needs to be done. Because infectious diseases do not respect national boundaries, the U.S. financial support for medical research, education, and disease containment is far more than an expression of basic humanitarian concern. It's profoundly in our national interest. Infectious diseases like HIV, AIDS know no borders. Millions of Americans travel and live abroad. Many in this country live with the disease in their own families. And the opportunity to do something about the disease scourge, offers coincidence both of self-interest and moral imperative. Out of a sense of self-preservation for mankind, if not simply a humanitarian concern for those affected, the disease has to be eradicated, whatever the cost. And I couldn't agree more with Dr. Piot. The United States has to lead. There is no alternative. And it's a responsibility we cannot duck. Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you very much, Congressman Leach. Dr. Piot, we have some time for some questions and answer. I ask that you use a microphone, please, because we are webcasting this live, and we want our online viewers to be able to hear the question. I also ask that you let us know who you are. So if we could go to Shanti Conley in the middle, please. First, start with Shanti.
Thank you both, Dr. Piot and Congressman Leach, for such inspiring presentations. My question is for Dr. Piot. I just came back 2 days ago from South Africa, and every time I come back from there, as Congressman Leach said, it so boggles the imagination, you know, the rates of infection, the size of the country, and yet the pace of new infections continues unabated. I think the estimate is something like over 500,000 new infections every year. Everything we're doing in treatment, in care, in support for orphans will be undermined unless we can turn off that spigot. And yet there's a broad consensus that whatever we're doing in prevention there, so far we haven't seen it working. You know, and South Africa perhaps has some special considerations, but some of that is probably generalizable to the rest of Southern Africa as well. Zimbabwe is the only country where we have seen so far a small decline in prevalence in that region. What are your thoughts about what we need to do to turn things around in Southern Africa and particularly in South Africa to make prevention work there? Thank you.
Should we capture a couple first?
Yeah,
Jim Shelton, please.
Well, I don't know, maybe the response to that might help me formulate my question better, but I actually wanted to applaud you, Peter, because I've listened to a lot of presentations on HIV over the years, and to be a little bit irreverent and oversimplify, and I apologize, it's usually been a sky is falling kind of presentation. And I want to congratulate you for coming across with, I think, what is a more mature and more appropriate presentation, which, yes, things are horrible, things are bad, but in fact, a lot of things are beginning to gel in prevention. A number of places in Africa, of which South Africa may be close also. I'm an epidemiologist at AID, by the way. My reading actually of Africa and India, by the way, is that they are both relatively stable, and in fact in South India, HIV is declining. Yeah. So there's kind of a tricky sort of presentation you need to make, which is to describe the gravity, but at the same time make the world aware that some of this stuff can work. So that's my statement. And I think I noticed a change in your sort of message, I think, based on the evidence. My question actually is that you may remember 2 years ago in the same place, I asked you about male circumcision, and at that time did not get a resounding amount of enthusiasm from you. So at that time I thought there was quite good evidence, but since then we now have a really good clinical trial that's showing a protective effect of male circumcision on HIV transmission in men and perhaps also in women. And I'm wondering if you've sort of evolved in that as well.
Okay. Why don't we get one more in the middle, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to answer the questions.
Hi, my name's Healy Thompson. I'm with the Center for Health and Gender Equity. Just echo the thanks to you both for your great leadership on this issue. My question is also for Dr. Piot, but I guess also perhaps for you, Congressman Leach, if you have a response. Dr. Piot, you spoke about point number 6, about strengthening health systems, healthcare workers, and also earlier spoke about the need for developing countries to continue to donate from their own budgets to this issue. And what we've seen is that in Kenya and Mozambique and perhaps in many other countries, they're running into the problem of budget ceilings, where they have caps on the amount of money that they can spend, caps that are derived from inflation reduction and deficit reduction targets by the IMF. And this is actually preventing countries from increasing their own spending on healthcare workers and healthcare infrastructure, or on applying for grants because it could increase their inflation. And so I was wondering what you thought we could do about this issue, either from a congressional standpoint with Treasury Department and Financial Services Committee, or as a broader international community.
Okay, terrific. Why don't we take those three, and then we have at least 3, 4, 5 more. Dr. Piot, if you'd like to kick us off.
Yes, thank you. On South Africa, it is true that this is in a sense, the biggest challenge because of, as you rightly said, over 500,000 new infections in 1 year. 1 year. It's just mind blowing, and every year I hope that we will see some good news, but not yet. I think that several points. One is that I think Zimbabwe provides us with a very important lesson, in the sense that also in southern Africa, in one of the countries that is the most affected in the world, that it is now possible to see a decline in new infections, and that despite a state that, as to say the least, has not been able to deliver. But because of longer-term investments, particularly through community-based organizations and local governments, city governments, I think we see that it's possible in such an extremely high level of infection. South Africa does have good HIV prevention programs, but something must be wrong. Otherwise, we would see progress. I mean, and it has been going on for quite a while. And I think there are several points. One is that it may be that the message about the importance and the relevance of AIDS in society is too ambiguous and or ambivalent. My English is not good enough to know which word to use here. That is one thing. Secondly, I think it provides an illustration that we need to address what the drivers of this epidemic are. It probably illustrates the limit of, condom promotion as it is big in South Africa, very big, good programs. But sexual violence continues. We need really to go to campaigns where there is probably a far more massive behavior change that's more fundamental, and where it's the position of women that is crucial here. But the problem is also it's against the background of extremely high unemployment rates, young people, the fact that poverty continues to be rampant and so on, but that we see also in other African countries, but it may be because it's far more in an urban context in South Africa, and also a continuing, abnormal, quote-unquote, division of labor, in a sense that we still have massive concentrations of men in huge, for work, coming from all parts of southern Africa, the migration patterns. I mean, it's. I think we should not blame anybody here that it's by any means an extremely complicated job because of the history of the labor markets, the poverty, and so on. But I believe that it's going to be extremely important to see whether the treatment programs, antiretroviral therapy programs that are being rolled out now in South Africa after long hesitation, but now the train is out of the station, and in some provinces, actually, the coverage starts to become reasonable. And if any country in Africa can do it, providing antiretroviral therapy, it is South Africa. How much impact will that have on prevention programs or not? I mean, it could go many ways. It could be negative, it could be positive. I mean, but certainly more people will come forward for being tested, for example, which should have a positive impact on the whole prevention issues. But I don't have a clear response to your question. I'm going to South Africa in the end of April to really look myself and sit down with people and discuss, because something must change. Jim, in terms of the message, just a few reflections on that. We are now, I think, the time of telling the world, and particularly traveling to Africa and telling Africans that AIDS is a problem. That's long beyond us, and still that's going on. Still, I think that's really not only a waste of time, but an insult to the African people. Everybody knows that, and we're now entering into a phase where there are some good news stories. There's no success story, I would say. Success would be stop AIDS, everybody living with HIV on treatment and so on. That's not there yet, but there's definitely results. And but if we emphasize that only, then we neglect the fact that there's still this crisis going on. If we only talk about the doom and gloom, it's also an insult for all the good work that's going on and for the results that are there. So communication-wise, I need some advice. And that will be when we have the special session of the General Assembly in New York in end of May, beginning of June. That will be a challenge in terms of what we tell, like the media and the world, because we know already from country reports that many have made progress, many have actually met targets that were set in 2001. I think that's an extremely important message, because we don't have too often that's the case. Usually we have these UN jamborees and where everybody say we failed bitterly, no targets is met, we need more money, thank you very much, we all go home, and things go back to where they were before. Now, I think here we have one of the Millennium Development Goals is about AIDS, where we do have progress. And thanks to all the hard work of so many people. How to present that is going to be difficult. On male circumcision, there are 2 trials that are going on still, so I think that we will have to see what they bring. But what we're doing at the moment, I know we disagree on this, but what we know, because this is surgery, and what we're doing at the moment is reviewing practical ways of, on a large scale, introducing male circumcision. Every year there are men dying because they're circumcised. That's something that we can't have, for sure. So we need to have a very simple procedure. We've had meetings with pediatric urologists, and I don't know much about that, with people reviewing also traditional practices. How can they be adapted? Reviewing with people how they look at it, because there are very few issues that in some communities that solicit such high emotions, because it's linked sometimes with religion, sometimes with tradition and so on. So our perspective is now preparing for what if we're going to roll out large-scale public programs. And that I think we've made quite good progress, but it will be, it's very different, for example, to say, okay, in the long term, for the long-term approach, circumcision at birth or around birth, that's something that is going to be easier to introduce, probably. For the short term, it will be requiring circumcising men who are already older. So these are very different issues, and we're working on let's say, the technical issues. On the whole issue of, let's say, fiscal space, as they call it at the IMF, and budget ceilings, we're looking at that. There are lots of stories about it, and the most prominent one comes from Kenya, where the Minister of Health says, I want to hire 6,000 nurses, and I'm not allowed to do that by the IMF. When the Minister of Finance tells you another story. we are at the moment in UNAIDS, we're like doing a survey and trying to figure out what is the situation. Other countries where, because of fiscal policies that are indeed trying to bring inflation under control, because hyperinflation, we know that hits the poor in the first place, because who is wealthy can have their investments in some stable dollar and will actually get richer because of hyperinflation. What is the reality? We've had some examples. A few years ago, Uganda, the Ministry of Finance refused originally a grant from the Global Fund. Was negotiated, and a solution was found. And we're discussing it at the moment with the Global Fund and with the IMF to see how sudden influxes of huge amounts of money in fragile economies and economies that are dependent from foreign aid or budgets, government budgets, foreign aid, how can that be used without introducing so-called Dutch disease, inflation, and so on? And there are techniques that make that possible. For example, so-called offshore procurement. Instead of sending money to a country to buy the drugs there, you can send the drugs, just to give, etc., etc. I don't pretend I know enough about fiscal and macroeconomics, but I know it is a real or a perceived problem, and we're working on it. We're bringing together all the various actors. Our board also has asked that we look into that. But I'm trying now at the moment to see what are the myths and what are the realities, and probably both are existing. But that will get only worse in the sense that with the commitments that have been made at Monterrey and subsequently, the development aid will go up. And it has been going up quite a bit over the last few years. So this is an issue that we have to tackle. And I discussed this with the director of the IMF, and who said there shouldn't be any obstacles for programs such as combating AIDS, and we must find the right technical solutions. But what these are, I don't feel competent. But maybe, Congressman, you have.
Well, I think this is a subject that Peter is the expert. I would only comment, though, that I've been in elected public life almost 30 years, and one of the great changes is not only issues, but the vocabulary one talks about. And when I began public life, it'd be inconceivable to talk about some of the things that we now have to talk about, that they're out of the family into the community. And whether it be the ABC issue that everybody in this room understands, the abstinence, be faithful, condoms. Now we have a question about male circumcision. And frankly, in public life, as an individual who's town meetings every other week, I will tell you that's a subject that's never come up. But I defer to your judgment and that of Dr. Piot, and I will tell you it might end up being a subject of congressional legislation. And that is an extraordinary phenomenon, absolutely extraordinary.
Yeah, true.
The other thing I want to refer to one thing that Dr. Piot mentioned, because it's very unusual and it's very seldom talked about in AIDS discussions. He mentioned sexual violence. And if you think of the ABC issue, liberals are very, very jaundiced about talking about the A and the B. Faith-based people are somewhat jaundiced about talking about the C. But the fact is there is a moral dimension to these things. Sexual violence, the dignity of the individual and the equalitarian dignity of the individual. And whether it's reflected in a political philosophy that might be identified with the American Creed, which is the Declaration of Independence about all individuals are created equal, or whether it be faith-based, in which there is an equalitarian dimension of faith. But when you have problems in society of social stratas and power in which people in powerful positions can impose themselves on people in more vulnerable positions, that is a political issue, but it's a moral issue. And we cannot do anything except look at it in those terms as well. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to have a consensus that this is a political challenge. It also involves a moral challenge. And that does not mean it's individual particularist faith, but it relates to faith.
Okay. Terrific. We have a number of other questions. We also have an overflow room, folks who couldn't come in, and I have some questions from the overflow room. I'll just put two of them out there, and then we'll come down here to the front. One was about the role of the faith-based community, and the Congressman just alluded to it, in terms of what role or roles do you suggest the global faith community could play in the next 20 years for this strategic agenda? And the other question was regarding playing off from Dr. Piot's comments about the increased need and recognition for flexibility in what we define as investment in addressing HIV, and that may be something around transportation or agriculture or clean water or some of these other associated interventions that may not fit our stereotypical or narrow definition of HIV spending. And the question is whether, as the U.S. constitutes its assistance in that area, whether we are flexible enough in our language to provide that flexibility to people on the ground, as well as those that we're asking to program that money here in the United States. So we have two questions. Julie, if you could come down the front. We have two right here in the front. The lady in the center, and then right over here. We can just move across the room.
Good afternoon. My name is Deirdre Lepin. I'm a social development specialist with the IFC. Dr. Piot mentioned the use of Shell's methodology of scenario planning in trying to predict some trends and developments in the course of this pandemic. That's one of many examples of contributions that the private sector, commercial private sector, has made in trying to combat this disease, whether for protecting its own workforce or out of a sense of responsibility to the larger community. And so I wanted to ask both of the speakers, what would be the 1, 2, or 3 top things that they would like to see the private sector do as partners in combating the AIDS pandemic?
Terrific. Thank you very much. I should also say for your brevity, since we don't have a whole lot of time. Right here, and then also, yeah.
I'm Sarah Friedman from the Global Health Council. Thank you both very much. And I'd like to, it's another topic that's beginning to get talked about a little more, which has to do with voluntary testing becoming not so voluntary, but automatic with an opt-out possibility. So I wanted, and Richard Holbrooke had written a very strong editorial about this weeks ago, and it provoked some from discussion. So I wanted to ask you both how you felt about this in general for Dr. Piot and for Congressman Leach in the United States. I know there are more and more states that are pushing for automatic testing or loss of federal funds if people are not willing to be tested. How you feel about this, and also the travel ban on people having to declare their HIV status in order to come into the United States. What your view on that is as well. Thank you.
Three quick points. They relate to what you said, Peter, about prevention and treatment, because I thought you made some excellent points. The first point you made early on was that you felt or you sensed that the funding gap would likely increase. And one of the reasons you gave makes very logical sense. By the way, I'm Kent Hill from USAID. And one of the reasons it's going to increase is obviously because of the other part of what you said in your comments, that the infections continue to be large enough every year that the number of people who are going to need to be treated, and for a lot of years, is going to grow. Which drives towards one of your key themes in here, was that we're going to have to spend more time thinking about prevention and not just treatment. And it's actually absolutely interrelated. If you don't get the prevention working better, the financial burdens on the treatment side are going to become horrendous. And so you've simply got to do that. And that brings me to my third and final point. If it's prevention we've got to spend more time thinking about, I would argue that the way you phrased your first point, you might consider doing a little differently and bring up into your, because you're such a prominent international spokesperson, people will really listen to what you have to say. But you talked right off the bat about what you called the drivers of the pandemic. And what you said the drivers had to do with stigma, gender, and homophobia. It occurs to me, if I take your whole speech into context, what the real driver is and what the experts say on transmission, of course, they say the driver is sexual transmission. All the behavior related to that, there can be a big debate about how to intervene to stop it, but the driver of this is primarily sexual transmission, which brings me to the final point, and this is what I'm so impressed, Peter, with your commitment to help lead, I think, an international rethinking of some of these issues, and your willingness to help the international community think about how do we do prevention in a way that avoids what has happened in the United States, and what Congressman Leach correctly pointed out is an unfortunate sort of culture war view of A, B, and C. We've got to find a better way to talk about this, which help people who have thought previously that A and B were simply the agenda of the right, to put this in the context that A and B are gender issues as well as human rights issues, as well as you put it, moral responsibility issues, and that C is a very legitimate and unavoidable and a right option as well, and we can make a case for that most conservatives can and will be able to, I think, endorse. But we've got to have to get a lot better about how we talk about it, and lives are at stake if we don't rethink the paradigm for the way we talk about prevention.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Kent. I appreciate you weighing in on these issues. I think, unfortunately, although I see lots of hands, we're going to have to give our panelists a final word because of commitments they both have immediately at the 3 o'clock hour. So, Dr. Piot, would you like to kick us off, and Congressman Leach?
Oh, I'll do my best to be very brief, but each of the questions would be material for another speech in itself. But role of faith-based community, yes, for me, part of the movement. I'm actually surprised that the question even comes up. When I got into this job, I had 3 objectives. The first one was to put AIDS on the political agenda, and so that it's not only a matter for specialists and AIDS activists. And I think that, secondly, because that's what you need, that if you want the money and the societal engagement. 2 is to build a broad coalition, and that all those who can contribute to the solution become part of the solution, and that's the faith-based community. I think that the key is that the faith-based community or business or whatever communities, that there is a constant dialogue, and that there is that everybody respects what the priorities are of a given country, and that we contribute each in our own way to reach these goals. There is the worst and the best in the faith-based community, just as in any other community. We've been, I think, in the UN system, we probably were the first ones. We've been the pioneer and the icebreaker, I would say, for many aspects of UN reform, many. At the moment, and it's a totally different issue, but now we've introduced payment by performance, part of it. I mean, that's also we're the first ones, and these are all complicated issues, but so AIDS unexpectedly is an entry point for reform. What are the need for flexibility? I think where AIDS funding can be used for, of course, somewhere the line has to be drawn. We can't solve all the world's problems because it's easier to get money for AIDS than for building health systems or for general poverty programs. That's clear. But for me, the principles are the following. One is, again, one needs to respect and follow and implement a comprehensive national strategy. Again, this morning at the CSIS briefing in the Senate, what Secretary Thompson said, that was their main conclusion, main recommendation to the government in Vietnam. Do you have that? And that's what should drive it. Secondly, there are issues that really need more attention when it comes to treatment. I think nutritional support is something that is clearly emerging. But again, how far do you go beyond that? But it's clear that when you're hungry, when you have an empty stomach, antiretrovirals are not going to do not only very good, but the incentive for treatment compliance will not be the top of your list. what Ken said is another issue, and that is that, and we've seen that in PEPFAR at the moment, is already including a far stronger gender agenda, pro-women agenda. Because when you just take A, B, C, each of the A and the B and the C require women's empowerment to make it really work. And as Congressman said also, it's an issue of rights. The way I look at it, for example, in terms of abstinence, a girl has the right to not to be raped, to put it very strongly. That's it. We should look at it from that perspective as well. But one thing I know is that anything that has the word only in it doesn't work for AIDS. I think the 20 years we've learned that. So it's really the full package that will make it work. But at some moment, some part of the package will be relevant, and in another instance or situation, it will be the other one. Private sector, my top two is first, good practice starts at home. HIV in the workplace programs, non-discrimination prevention programs, and in developing country where there is no health care available outside, providing the health care. And the Global Business Coalition has been quite pushing that. And secondly, I would say what I ask from business is not so much money to contribute to others, but use the skill of business to make our programs more effective. I think that's where, and that can be from the most obvious, and for me, so I always give the example of MTV. If you want to reach teenagers, whether you like that or not, that's what they watch, and it's MTV, and having them use their medium with messages and so on, then you reach 1 billion teenagers. Fourth, on voluntary counseling, testing, and so on. The policies in the UN system changed a year and a half ago, nearly 2 years already. We did not wait for Mr. Holbrooke to publish something. It is indeed based on the fact that with treatment becoming far more available, antiretroviral therapy, that there is a much better case for more aggressive access to HIV testing. But testing alone doesn't make it. Just remind you that the former Soviet Union, the main approach, I'm talking the Soviet days, was testing, hundreds of millions of people, but no education, no counseling, and treatment didn't exist. That was not the fault of the Soviet Union. So we need to see it as a package, as part, again, of a comprehensive approach. But I totally disagree with Ambassador Holbrooke that just with widespread testing that we're going to stop this epidemic. It has to be part of behavior change programs, of treatment programs, and we need to talk to people, not just take blood and then say, here is your result. So we've become far more open and supportive, and that's now starting to be implemented. On last point on the drivers of the epidemic, of course it's sexual transmission, but I was thinking, why is, for example, Africa more affected than anybody else? I think it has to do with the poverty, with the way that the labor market is organized, migration patterns, the situation, the position of women, so on, and of course also all issues that define sexual behavior. Sexual behavior is not only a matter of, that's not endocrinology, not only hormones. It happens in a certain context. And that's what I was thinking of, but I think the way you phrase it is to be very useful, and I agree with the analysis of that. We're talking here about rights and gender, and I think that's probably the common ground for when it comes to preventing sexual transmission, looking at it from a gender perspective and a rights perspective. And then, we should spend more energy in doing things than in fighting each other on, who's right and who's wrong. But it should be, it's one thing to promote certain, approaches, and it's another one to say what the others are doing is wrong. That, I think, is counterproductive and costs lives. So thanks again for very stimulating questions, and I think that certainly I've learned a lot again. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let me just add briefly, and I'll be short on this, that in our society, in all societies, there are, in historical time periods, and this one at the moment, contrasts between faith and science, in which there are judgmental differences that are being made. What's impressive here is how important it is that we not put the two in contradistinction, that we should bring them together. The ABC initiative implies an uneasiness, but it also implies a consensus. It's an uneasy consensus, but it is a consensus. It's a consensus that makes legislation possible, and it's a consensus that makes workability possible in other societies. And I would only stress that on the public side, where there is some tension with the faith-based community, most public officials are driven by a sense of concern for the individual, which, after all, is morality or faith-based. And so in the individuals involved, there are differences of judgment, but there aren't necessarily wide chasms of difference in morality. It's just how one reflects it. But it is very important that science and faith not be at odds. On the private sector issue, I look at it in two ways. There's the corporate side, and American research is not of trivial dimension on the private side. And then this country that has the most sophisticated healthcare research and science in the world also has the most expensive healthcare delivery system in the world. And so we have to give some real emphasis on what the private sector can do to alleviate cost in particularly poor countries. And that is an ongoing and troubling but very large dimension of this. Finally, let me just say on the private side, there is also a charity side of the private sector in America. And anyone that deals in the HIV/AIDS area has to tip their hat to Bill Gates and other foundations, but principally the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that have done so much in terms of basic research and also in prevention in countries of the world like India, where they are really a cornerstone of effort. And so I want to just stress that there is a private sector that is something that we have to be appreciative of. There are several questions that are asked that, frankly, I don't know the answer to, and I'd love to know the perspective of whoever answered the question if we could talk after this meeting. Anyway, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sir.
Well,